Chapter 25, Indirect Statement. Chapter 25 covers the following: the formation of all Latin infinitives, active and passive, the formation and translation of indirect statement, infinitives and relative time, and the use of reflexive pronouns and adjectives in indirect statement. At the end of the lesson, we'll review the vocabulary which you should memorize in this chapter. There are three important rules to remember in this chapter. Rule 1. The formula for indirect statement in Latin is a verb of the head plus an accusative subject plus an infinitive verb. Rule 2. There is no that in Latin, at least not in the sense of say or think that. And Rule 3. Infinitives show relative time. Okay, I won't lie to you. Here comes one of the hardest things you're going to have to learn in this class. The way Latin says that, in the sense, I said that, you're going to have to be a real Roman and work hard here. The reason that what we're going to cover in this lesson is tough is that English and Latin idiom differ so much here that you're going to have to build a deep understanding of how grammar works to move successfully between our and the Roman manner of expressing this type of construction. We learned the principle of relative versus absolute time when we studied participles in Chapter 23. Now, you're going to have to put that theory into practice. If you were studying Latin from the vantage point of a language that expressed indirect statement the same way Latin does, this lesson would be a snap, and this presentation 15 minutes and done. We wouldn't even have to say the words relative time. But sadly for us, that's not the case. Or, in this case, the mood. It's relatively easy for English speakers to learn some things about Latin because our languages operate the same way. Not here. But know this: once you're done with indirect statement, the battle is all but won. Yes, there are still a few foes to slay, like the subjunctive mood, but stretch your hand in victory over the frowning countenance of indirect statement, and you can start weaving your laurel wreath, even if you can't crown your brow quite yet. Before we begin the battle, let's suit you up with a proper armor for this fight, a full quiver of infinitives. What's the collective noun for infinitives? Well, let's see. If they're infinite, an eternity of infinitives? Oh, for heaven's sakes, I haven't even begun and I'm already off topic. Such a professor. Yes, all the infinitives Latin has to offer, in all tenses and voices, active and passive, present, perfect, and future, where, just as with participles, these terms are misleading. We've already studied the present infinitive in both these voices, so let's start with a chart, much like the one we used for participles, and insert the proper forms of the Latin infinitive, beginning with the present active, the form you've known almost since day one, the are, ere, ire forms of the verb. This translates as to do whatever the verb means. An example is laudare, to praise. Please tell me this is not exciting new information for anyone out there. To make this type of infinitive passive, Latin changes the ending, mostly adding a long I quality, pronounced E in Latin, which results in are, are, e, and ire across the 4.5 conjugations. The only real issue here is that the third conjugation E present passive infinitive ending is so minimal, it's sometimes hard to recognize that it means to be whatevered, as do all the present passive infinitives. Thus, for example, laudare means to be praised. All that should be review for you. Now, the fun begins, with the perfect active infinitive, formed by taking the perfect active base, what you get when you drop the first person singular, I ending from the third principal part, and add issy. For all the horrors of indirect statement, this is the only new form introduced in Chapter 25. It translates as to have whatevered. For instance, laudavisi, to have praised. Its passive counterpart, the perfect passive infinitive, is formed by taking the perfect passive participle and adding esse, not as an ending but a separate word. Like all perfect passive forms in Latin, this will be made up of two words. It means to have been whatever, as in laudatum esse, to have been praised. Moving to the last two infinitives, both future tense forms, the future active infinitive is made up of the future active participle, that weird but memorable urus form, plus esse. Like the perfect passive infinitive, it's two words, and translates as to be, esse, about or going to whatever the participle means. For example, laudaturem esse, to be about or going to praise, which is about as periphrastic as it comes. Why doesn't English have to will praise? We have to have praised. Why is that okay, but to will praise isn't? If I were king of the universe... never mind. The big thing to remember here is that both the future active and perfect passive infinitives contain two words, one of which is a participle, and since participles are adjectives, they'll change their endings, us, a, to accommodate whatever they modify. We'll talk about that more in a moment. The final form finishing out this chart is the future passive infinitive, which takes the perfect passive participle, the fourth principal part of the verb, and adds ere, a separate word, producing a form that translates literally as to be about or going to be whatever, as in laudatum ere, meaning to be about to be praised. Hideous thing, huh? Well, here's some good news then. You don't have to learn this form. It occurs so rarely, it's not worth memorizing. I can only assume Wheelock includes it merely to fill out the chart. Before we go on to examine the use of these infinitives in indirect statement, let's draw attention to a basic fact about these forms. Both present infinitives and the perfect active infinitive are one word. The other three infinitives, the perfect passive and both futures, are two words. Even more notable is the presence of all six possible forms, both voices and all three tenses, which is different from participles, where two of the forms, present passive and perfect active, are missing. The reason infinitives cannot afford to be so lean is about to become clear. Latin needs them for, drumroll, indirect statement. Another subordinate construction, like ablative absolutes, but even more pervasive in Latin. By statement, the name of this construction means that it incorporates a thought of some kind. By indirect, it means that the thought is indirectly related. That is, it conveys only the general nature of the thought, not the exact words that were originally used to express it. A direct statement quotes someone's words directly. In other words, not in other words. For example, he said, "I'm hungry." "I'm hungry" were his exact words. That's a direct quote. An indirect statement expresses the same idea, but doesn't use the actual words in which it was originally stated. Instead, it reframes the thought in different words. For example, he said that he wanted to eat. Wanting to eat is the same general thing as being hungry, but "I want to eat" were not his exact words. "I'm hungry" were his exact words. So, that he wanted to eat is indirect statement. To have indirect statement, you need a word, most often a verb, which connotes thinking, feeling, seeing, hearing, some sort of activity that's processed in your brain. These are often and quite rightly termed verbs of the head. It's really not possible to kick that you want to eat. You have to say that you want to eat, or believe, understand, perceive, consider, note, judge, conclude, lie, all things which you do with your head, not your feet. And note that English uses that to introduce indirect statement. For example, he said that he wanted to eat. This that is a subordinating conjunction. It introduces a clause, not the demonstrative adjective or pronoun we've already learned about. For example, that man. Consider the following sentence. He said that man was hungry. The first that, he said that, is the subordinating conjunction introducing indirect statement. The second that man, is the demonstrative adjective. And there's the rub. While Latin does have a demonstrative form equivalent to English that, it doesn't have the counterpart of the English subordinating conjunction that, the one introducing indirect statement. In place of a that clause, Latin uses an infinitive. So, for example, Latin says, I believe him to be a friend, where English can say either, I believe him to be a friend, or I believe that he is a friend. Latin can't say the latter. As I was taught, there's no that in Latin. So here's the formula for indirect statement. A verb of the head plus an accusative subject plus an infinitive verb. For example, I believe, verb of the head, him, accusative subject, to be, infinitive verb, a friend. Note the grammatical difference between this construction, accusative subject plus infinitive verb, and the that construction English has and Latin doesn't. In the that construction, the subject is nominative and the verb finite. For example, I believe that he, nominative subject, is, finite verb, a friend. It's a simple-looking difference, but its consequences are far-reaching. To wit, let's look at the infinitive construction more closely. I believe him to be a friend. What case would friend be in Latin? How is it functioning inside its own construction? What is friend doing grammatically? It's renaming or modifying him through the verb to be. So, it's a predicate noun. That means it has to agree with the subject it goes with in case. And the subject here, him, is accusative because it's inside indirect statement. A predicate accusative? Who thought that to be a possibility? And here's another complication. Like participles, infinitives show relative, not absolute time. That is, the actual time value of the infinitive depends on the tense of the main verb. So, like participles, present infinitives would better be termed contemporaneous. Common sense tells you that, in the sentence, he needs to do it, the infinitive to do is happening at the same time as the needing. He needs right now to do it right now, today. But change the main verb to past tense, he needed to do it, and now it's all taking place in the past. Yesterday, he needed to do it yesterday. Likewise, he will need to do it is all in the future. Tomorrow, he will need to do it tomorrow. That means these so-called present tense infinitives, like to do, are not all necessarily taking place in the present. They're following the tense of the main verb. And just like perfect participles, perfect infinitives show prior action. That is, action that took place prior to the main verb, whatever tense that main verb might be. For example, he claims to have done it. To have done is a perfect infinitive. The main verb claims is present tense, so it has a time value of +0. The infinitive to have done, however, is past tense, that is perfect. So it has a time value of -1. It shows action prior to the main verb. Future infinitives, like future participles, show action subsequent to the main verb, and they come with their own set of issues. Translating Latin future infinitives literally produces clunky English sentences like, he needs to be about to do it. In other words, he needs now today to do it in the future, tomorrow. English avoids saying this way because our future active infinitive is so disagreeably periphrastic. But I think you see the point about relative time. The infinitive is happening in the future relative to the main verb. If you make the main verb past tense, he needed to be about to do it, meaning he needed in the past, yesterday, to do it so that it was done by now, today, you can see that the so-called future infinitive is now happening in the past, actually subsequent to the past, between the past and the present. By being past tense, the main verb has dragged it back there. Whenever you're converting thoughts between relative time verb forms like infinitives and absolute time verb forms like finite verbs, there's no way around dealing with this sort of time value shift. In other words, when translating a Latin infinitive-based indirect statement into an English finite verb-based that clause, you'll have to manage the verb tenses appropriately. If you're moving from Latin to English, you'll have to convert relative time to absolute time. Conversely, if you're turning an English sentence into Latin, you'll have to translate absolute time into relative time. Let's stop and sum up what indirect statement entails. It's easier to see the rules when you imagine moving from English to Latin. So let's look at it that way. First, take out that. There's no that in Latin. Second, turn the subject, which is nominative in English because it's attached to a finite verb, into an accusative in Latin, because now it's associated with an infinitive, and infinitives take accusative, not nominative subjects. Third, make the finite verb an infinitive, and be careful with the tense. So, for example, where English says, I will show that he, nominative subject, is, finite verb, a fool, Latin will say, I will show him, accusative subject, to be, infinitive, a fool. Here's some good news. You actually know how to do this, or you wouldn't be able to speak and understand English. You've just never thought about it as such, or attached big words like contemporaneous to your infinitives. Take this sentence. I consider her to be my friend. Now say the same thing, but use that. I consider that she is my friend. Easy, no? The English verb consider slides smoothly back and forth between an accusative infinitive and a that clause. So does believe. I believed her to be my friend. Rephrase the sentence with that. I believed that she was my friend. Was. Be careful. Making the main verb past tense draws the infinitive into the past, relative versus absolute time. But note how easily that shift came to you. That's because you know how to do it. So really, all you have to do here is be aware of what you do naturally. You're only learning what you already know. Here, I'll show you. Take this English sentence. I believe that the teacher is a demon in human form. Change it to the way Latin would say the same thing. That is, use an infinitive. That's right. I believe the teacher to be a demon in human form. And note that teacher here would be accusative in Latin. Keep going. No one has yet discovered that I am the one who killed the demon teacher. How would Latin say that without that? No one has yet discovered me to be the one who killed the demon teacher, where me is accusative. They will claim that you did it. What would the Latin be? They will claim you, accusative, to have done it. Who says you can't get away with murder? Latin. Who says you, accusative, not to be able to get away with murder? Wow, that's not really very English. But it makes sense if you think about it. It's just not the way we say it. But we could say it that way. And Romans did say it that way all the time, whenever they used any of their verbs of the head. We can do it easily with consider, believe, less so with claim, never with say. You're going to have to extend what you naturally do with consider and believe to all verbs of the head. It's that simple and that hard. When in doubt, teachers always resort to charts, so let's chart out indirect statement. There are 9 possibilities, because the main verb can be present, past, or future, and the infinitive can be present, perfect, or future. Using the example sentence, he says that we are writing a letter, where the main verb is he says, and the indirect statement is that we are writing, let's turn English idiom into its Latin equivalent. In this case, he says us to write. Dicit, he says, nos litera scribere, literally, us to write a letter. In English idiom, that would be, he says that we write or are writing a letter. Now what if the infinitive is future? Dicit nos litteras scripturos esse. Literally, he says us to be about to write a letter. Or in better English, he says that we will write a letter. And here it is with a perfect infinitive. Dicit nos litteras scriptissi, meaning literally, he says us to have written a letter. English would say, he says that we wrote or have written a letter. With a future tense main verb, he will say, things change very little. Dicet nos litteras scribere, literally, he will say us to write a letter, meaning he will say that we are writing a letter. Note that the saying and the writing are happening at the same time, in the future. So why don't we make the verb in the that clause future? That has to do with an English idiom we'll address in a later lesson. Let's leave it alone for now. But if you absolutely have to know why the present is used here, ask me in person. You will see that I do not shy away from sharing the mysteries of the future with any eager initiate. Back to the chart. With a future infinitive, dicet nos litteras scripturos esse, literally, he will say us to be about to write a letter. In idiomatic English, that would be, he will say that we will write a letter. That is, in the future, he will say that further ahead in the future, we'll write the letter. If there were a plus future, and there isn't, it would live right here. Using a perfect infinitive, dicet nos litteras scriptissi, meaning in Latin, he will say us to have written a letter, is the equivalent of English, he will say that we wrote or have written a letter. No problem with tenses anywhere in this part of the chart. But now, let's look at what happens when the main verb is past tense, dixit. This is where relative and absolute time issues come into play. Adding a present tense infinitive, nos litteras scribere, produces literally, he said us to write a letter. English would say, he said that we wrote or have written a letter. The present infinitive has a -1 absolute time value here because the main verb is past tense. A future infinitive produces the same sort of difficulty. Dixit nos litteras scripturos esse. He said us to be about to write a letter, which means in English, he said that we would write a letter. One way to remember this equivalence is to learn the rule that Latin infinitives ending urum esse, or any accusative ending, uram, uros, uras, ura, in indirect statement, are equal to will or would in English. Will if the main verb is present or future, would if it's past tense. It's really that easy. Now let's see what happens if both the main verb and the infinitive are past. Dixit nos litteras scripsissi, meaning literally, he said us to have written a letter. What would be the English that clause equivalent? He said that we had written a letter. A -1 time value main verb plus a -1 relative time value infinitive adds up to -2 in absolute time. That's pluperfect, had. Finally, let's look at something you'll be seeing a lot of in indirect statement: reflexive pronouns and adjectives. Remember what reflexive means? What do reflexive forms reflect? That's right, the subject, a nominative subject, which up until now was the only type of subject you've encountered. That's why there aren't nominative forms for reflexive pronouns. This is all coming back to you? But what happens in indirect statement where the subject is accusative? Sentences with indirect statement very often have two subjects, one nominative with the main verb and one accusative with the infinitive. Which one do you think makes more sense for the reflexive form to reflect? In other words, can a reflexive reflect an accusative subject? No, they have to reflect nominatives. In theory, of course. Roman authors break this rule all the time, but it's still the rule. Let's learn the rule before we learn how to bend it. The upshot here is that the accusative reflexive pronoun say shows up a lot in indirect statement. People often say that they, meaning themselves, are doing things. He said that he was hungry, meaning he himself, not he, that other man over there. Whenever the subject of the main verb reappears in the indirect statement, and it often does as the subject of the indirect statement, this situation produces a reflexive. Consider this example. Dicit se hoc scire. He says that he knows this. Here both the he's are the same person. By contrast, here's the non-reflexive form, dicit eum hoc scire. He says that he, that is, someone else, knows this. The same principle holds true for the reflexive possessive adjective suis Discet eam matrem suam esse. He will learn that she is his, meaning his own, mother. Here his must refer back to the subject of the main verb. The non-reflexive counterpart of this statement would be discet eam matrem eius esse. He will learn that she is his, meaning someone else's, mother. I told you that this was going to be rough going. Please note indirect statement. But master this, and I assure you that you're over the hump. Another indirect statement. See how common it is? Let's review. The formula for indirect statement is simple and straightforward. A verb of the head in the main sentence sets up the possibility of indirect statement, which will have an accusative subject, axis we'll call this, and an infinitive verb, inf this. Latin doesn't use a that clause the way English does because there's no that in Latin. And don't forget that accusative subjects will create accusative predicates. Relative time comes into play because English speakers are forced to switch back and forth between a Latin relative time verb form, the infinitive, and an English finite verb in a that clause. Relative time verb forms change their absolute time value in accordance with the tense of the main verb. The same is true of participles. When applied to infinitives or participles, the term present really means contemporaneous, that is, happening at the same time as the main verb. Perfect means prior, the action of the infinitive or participle happened before the time of the main verb. Future indicates subsequent action after the time of the main verb. Oh, it's so complicated in theory, but fortunately, in practice, it's much simpler, because all the relative time business only matters when the tense of the main verb is past, throwing everything back one step in time. Thus, when a present infinitive is associated with the past tense main verb, the infinitive's really taking place in the past, contemporaneous with the main verb. Translate it as was, did, have, or something with a -1 time value. If there's a perfect infinitive with the past tense main verb, it's super simple. Had. Just say had. Future infinitives with the past tense main verb are the equivalent of would in a that clause. Think about it this way. Would is really willed. The future tense marker will with the past tense marker ed. Future will plus past ed equals would. Finally, you're going to see a lot of reflexive forms in indirect statement. It's one of their major uses, especially as the SIS, subject of indirect statement. So get ready for them. And remember, reflexives reflect nominative, not accusative subjects, or at least that's the rule. For example, dixisti te venturum esse. You said that you would come. The same you is doing the saying and future coming. So the second you, the one in indirect statement, is reflexive. But the reflexive isn't always the subject of the indirect statement. It can be anything grammatically. For instance, dixisti eum tecum venturum esse. You said that he would come with you. Here the reflexive is an ablative of accompaniment. And just because we talk about other people a lot, the he said, she said human habit, very often reflexives in indirect statement are third person. Some form of se or suis, like dixit se suum librum habere. He said that he had his own book. There are two reflexives there, one a pronoun and one an adjective. Make the subject of the main verb plural and look how it changes the English translation. Dixerunt se suum librum habere. They said that they had their own book. And the teacher says that it's now time to move on to the vocabulary for chapter 25. The first word is hostis masculine, meaning enemy. It's a third declension I-stem noun. It's parasyllabic. In the singular, this word means an enemy. In the plural, it means the enemy. The enemy is a collective noun in English. That is, it's grammatically singular, but it refers to a group of individuals, like class or troop. Etymologically, hostis is related to English guest or host, both stemming from a sense of stranger. Also related is the Greek base xeno, from which we get xenophobia, the fear of strangers. The next word is humanus meaning humane, kind, refined, or cultivated. It's a first-second declension adjective, employing the same base as the noun homo hominis. Thus it means literally pertaining to humankind. The next word is another adjective, immortalis immortale, meaning not subject to death, immortal. It's third declension, so it must be I-stem. It's a combination of the prefix in, here in its assimilated form im, meaning not, and the base mort, meaning death, a base we've already encountered in the noun mors mortis. The next word is a verb, iet iunt, meaning he says, they say, or assert. Its conjugation is unclear, perhaps third io. There's not enough of it attested to make a clear determination. And that's because this is a defective verb, meaning it doesn't have all its parts. Roman authors use it almost invariably in the third person, although the first person singular io and second person singular iis are attested in a few works, not many. It also occurs in the present tense mainly, though here and there it shows up in the imperfect, iebat. Be aware that this is a verb of the head, and often introduces indirect statement. He says that. The next word is another verb, credo, credere, credidi, creditum, meaning believe or trust. Its third conjugation. The odd-looking perfect base, credid, is a product of reduplication, like do, dari, dedi, datum, of which credo is probably a compound of some sort. What the affix cre represents is unclear, though some scholars suggest it's related to the same base that gives us cardi, heart. In that case, credo originally meant put one's heart into something, that is, have confidence in it. Note that because of its meaning, credo expects an indirect object, literally, to give trust or be trusting to someone. It also expects indirect statement, to believe that. Another verb follows, nego, first conjugation, meaning deny or say that not. Indirect statement also follows nego often, which is used by Roman authors to negate the indirect statement, producing the sense, I said that something did not happen, which is only a hair's difference from denying it, but renders much more idiomatic English. In other words, where we like to say, he says that she did not come, the Romans preferred, he denies, negat, her to have come. The next word, yet another verb that takes indirect statement, is nuntio, first conjugation, meaning announce, report, or relate. That so many verbs in the vocabulary for this chapter take indirect statement can hardly come as a shock. So here's another one. Puto, first conjugation, meaning reckon, suppose, judge, think, or imagine. Do you think that this verb takes indirect statement? Etymologically, it's a fascinating verb. Originally, it comes from a base that means to prune, as in prune or trim a bush. As Latin developed, its tidy up the garden sense led to another connotation, clean up one's financial accounts. That later evolved into think. So it's fundamentally a metaphor based on farming, something the early Romans did a lot of, and thus affected their thinking and vocabulary, as can be seen from other Latin words which are based on agricultural terminology. For instance, pecunia, money. Compare English impecunious. What do you think that means? Good. Having no money, pecuni. Pecunia comes from a base that means cattle, pecus in Latin. Also, rivalis, giving us the word rival, which meant originally pertaining to a riverbank, rivus, its adversarial sense coming from the frequent conflicts Romans had over water rights. And finally, felix, happy. Compare English felicity, meaning happiness, which stems from a term that means fruitful or fertile. These words show that the Romans' deep ties to the land have clearly shaped their language. Here's another first conjugation verb, spero, meaning hope or hope for. Isn't it nice how many of these verbs which take indirect statement are first conjugation, the easiest of the conjugations to form? Romanis gratias ago. The infinitive used with spero when it is followed by indirect statement is almost invariably future. For instance, spero eam venturam esse, meaning literally, I hope her to be about to come. That is, I hope she will come. Next, Mr. Wheelock reminds you about the difference between the future active participles victurum with the short I and victurum with the long I. The former victurum comes from vinco, and means about to conquer. The latter, victurum, from vivo, about to live. That makes the long I in the live participle technically mandatory. While it's good advice, the reason Wheelock brings this up here baffles me. It's a subtle distinction in relatively rare forms. Put this information carefully and securely in the back of your brain. O adolescens, adolescentis, masculine, meaning young man. A third declension, non-I stem noun. What's the accusative plural of this word? It's third declension. Yes, adolescentes. That's also the vocative, isn't it? O adolescentes. Next is an adjective, fidelis fidele, meaning faithful or loyal. It's third declension, so this one is I stem. Think about what this word expects. You're faithful or loyal to someone, so it takes a dative after it. This is called a dative with special adjective, or you can just say dative with fidelis. What's its ablative singular? Hint, it's I stem. Good, fideli. And its neuter accusative plural? Yeah, fidelia. And here's an easy word, hic, meaning here, an adverb, so it doesn't change form. One thing to note, however, is the mandatory long mark over the I. That distinguishes here, hic, from this man, hic. And the final word of this vocabulary list is nescio nesciri, nescivi nescitum, meaning not know, that is, be unaware of, fail to understand. It's a fourth conjugation verb. It's a combination of ne, meaning not, and scio, meaning know, a verb of the head, and as such expects indirect statement. Thus nescimus, for instance, means we do not know that. After the classical age, as Latin began changing into modern languages, this word embarked upon a fascinating etymological journey. Starting as nesciens in Latin, meaning not knowing, ignorant, by the 13th century it had taken on the sense foolish. By the 14th century it had adopted a sexual connotation, wanton, which mellowed to coy by the 15th century. It since continued to elevate in the 16th century, where it came to mean dainty or subtle. Over the next 2 centuries, it became agreeable, and from there it was a short step to our word nice, meaning reasonably good. So, etymologically, nice means stupid. No comment. If you're still with me and still alive, does the vast swath of grammatical Mordor we just slogged across make even a semblance of sense to you now? And the rules we cited at the beginning, they looked so nice. But how are you? Still nesciens in the original sense of the word? If you are, spend another day of your life reviewing this presentation, please. If you're not so nice in its Roman sense, then count yourself among the blessed and walk into the light of the worksheet for Chapter 25. Here's a link. In fact, here's a whole chain. Catenas tenete, o adolescentes scientes.